September 1945. Berlin. A Soviet IS-3 tank rolls through rubble-strewn streets, and every Allied officer watching goes pale. Not because of the parade. Because they realize right then, right there, that their best guns cannot touch it. That single moment of silence ignited one of the most obsessive weapons programs in Cold War history. Engineers would spend years building something so extreme, so physically violent, that firing it once nearly destroyed the vehicle it was mounted on. A 183mm gun, the largest anti-tank cannon ever built, on a chassis that was never supposed to carry it. One shot could split a Conqueror tank's gun mantlet clean in half. One shell weighed as much as a full-grown adult human being, and the recoil 95 tons of force slammed backward through a tank that weighed only 50. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Join us as we dig into more stories, historical events, and moments of incredible human ingenuity from the past. This community is built for people who want the real story, not the textbook version. This is the story of the FV4005, a machine born from panic, built by brilliant, exhausted men who were told to do the impossible. A vehicle that worked perfectly and was canceled anyway. And it all started with a mechanic named Harold Webb, standing in a cold Birmingham workshop in 1951, staring at a blueprint that made absolutely no sense. Harold was not a general, not a decorated officer. He was a 43-year-old tooling engineer from the West Midlands who had spent the war maintaining Churchill tank engines and had the grease permanently embedded in his knuckles to prove it. He had seen what happened when a tank gun met armor it couldn't penetrate. He had dragged burned crew members out of knocked-out hulls. He understood in a way that the officers writing specifications never quite did what failure actually looked like up close. When Harold looked at that blueprint, a 183mm gun to be mounted on a modified Centurion chassis, his first words, according to the man standing next to him, were, "This is going to kill someone." He was not wrong, but he kept working anyway, and what he and his team built would set a record that no nation on Earth has broken in over 70 years. September 1945. The Allied victory parade in Berlin should have been a moment of pure triumph. 4 years of war. Tens of millions dead. The Reich in ruins. British units marched. American units marched. French units marched. The crowds watched. And then the Soviet column came. The IS-3 tanks moved through the broken streets like something from a different era of warfare entirely. They were low, impossibly low for something that size. The hull nose came to a distinctive point, the famous pike nose designed not for aesthetics, but for physics. A shell striking that angled surface would deflect. It would skid off harmlessly, while the men inside continued forward unharmed. The turret sat wide and almost hemispherical, a dome of steel that offered almost nothing flat for a shell to bite into. Frontal armor on the hull ran to 120mm. The turret in its most critical zones reached 230mm of protection. For context, the M4, Sherman America's workhorse tank, carried 63mm of frontal armor. The IS-3 had nearly 4 times that protection in key areas. And it had just rolled through Berlin in front of every senior Allied armor officer on the continent. The British officers watching did the mental arithmetic immediately. Their best tank gun at that moment, the 17-pounder, which had finally given the Allies a credible anti-armor weapon in the final years of the war, could not reliably penetrate the IS-3 frontally at combat ranges. Not even close. They were looking at a machine they could not kill, and they knew it, and they said nothing to each other, because there was nothing useful to say. Back in London, the silence broke into urgent meetings. The Americans were having the same conversations in Washington. Both nations came to the same conclusion. Within months, they needed a new class of heavy tank, with a gun powerful enough to defeat whatever the Soviets had built, plus whatever the Soviets might build next. Because this was the central fear, not just the IS-3 as it existed in 1945, but the IS-4, the IS-5, the vehicle that Soviet engineers were already drawing that nobody in the West had seen yet. The British response was the FV4005, The Conqueror, 65 tons, up to 178 millimeters of frontal armor, armed with a 120 millimeter rifled gun, capable of penetrating 450 millimeters of homogeneous steel at 900 meters. On paper, the Conqueror solved the problem. Its 120 millimeter gun had more than double the penetrating capability needed to defeat an IS-3. But the War Office was not satisfied with solving the problem as it currently existed. They wanted to solve every version of the problem that might ever exist. What if the next Soviet tank had 300 millimeters of armor? What if it had 350? What if the IS-3 was not the ceiling, but the floor? Gay. This thinking produced a technical specification in the early 1950s that reads even today like something written by men who had lost perspective on what was physically reasonable. The new gun had to penetrate 152 millimeters of armor, angled at 60 degrees from vertical, from a distance of 1,800 meters. 60 degrees of slope. Nearly 2 kilometers of range. Those numbers combined pointed in only one direction, a gun of a caliber that had never been attempted before on a vehicle intended to move across a battlefield. The specification landed on the desks of British ordnance engineers in 1950. They studied it, they ran the calculations, and they arrived at 183 millimeters. Not because someone wanted to build the biggest gun in history, because the mathematics of terminal ballistics given those penetration requirements at that distance using the Hesh shell concept they had selected produced 183 as the answer. The caliber was not a statement, it was a solution. Harold Webb was not involved in those early theoretical calculations. He was still in Birmingham, still working on engine tolerances and track components for vehicles already in production. But the engineering world that created the FV4005 specification was the same world Harold had inhabited for 20 years. And when the project began drawing in specialists from across the British defense industry, his name came up. He had a reputation. Not for brilliance in the flashy sense, Harold was not the kind of engineer who gave speeches or wrote papers. His reputation was for a particular quality that becomes invaluable when you are trying to do something that has never been done before. He could look at a system that was theoretically sound and immediately identify the 17 ways it would fail in practice. During the war, this ability had saved lives. He had flagged a fuel line routing problem on Churchill tanks 6 months before it would have caused catastrophic fires in North Africa. He had identified a stress fracture pattern in track links that maintenance crews were consistently missing. The people who worked with him described it the same way repeatedly. Harold could see failure before it happened. When he arrived at the project facility in 1951 and saw the preliminary specifications for what would become the FV4005, he immediately saw several things that concerned him deeply. The first was the recoil figure, 95 tons. He stood in front of that number for a long time. The Centurion chassis being proposed as the platform weighed 50 tons in combat configuration. The recoil force at the moment of firing would exceed the total weight of the vehicle by nearly double. Harold took out his notebook and started calculating what that meant for the suspension. The hull weld seams, the turret ring-bearing surfaces. The numbers were not comfortable. Then the second concern was the ammunition handling system. A 72.5 kilogram shell, a 33 kilogram propellant charge. 2 loaders working in a turret that had to be kept compact enough to mount on the Centurion's existing turret ring. He sketched the geometry. He sketched it again with different dimensions. The space available for the loaders to physically maneuver a shell that weighed as much as a person was by any reasonable ergonomic standard inadequate. He brought these concerns to the project lead. He was told the specifications had already been approved. He was told his job was to make it work within those parameters, not to question them. Harold wrote his objections in his notebook, dated them, and got back to work. This was the moment his colleagues would later say, when Harold Webb stopped being a man implementing a project and became a man trying to prevent a disaster from inside the machine building it. The design process for the turret was, by the account of everyone involved, deeply uncomfortable. The constraints were absolute. The gun weighed 4 tons. The turret ring diameter was fixed by the Centurion hull. The ammunition required 2 loaders. The armor specification, and this was the decision that Harold found most difficult to accept professionally, was set at 14 millimeters for the turret walls. Date: 14 millimeters. The sides of the Centurion hull that this turret would sit on carried 38 to 51 millimeters of protection. The turret they were building to sit on top of it would be protected less effectively than a factory security door. The reasoning was logical. In a cold strategic sense, the FV4005 was not supposed to be a frontline vehicle. It was a long-range ambush system designed to fire from concealment at distances where the enemy could not identify it, let alone target it. Armor was dead weight for a vehicle that was never supposed to be seen. Harold understood the logic. He did not like it. He had pulled men out of vehicles where the armor held, and they were still dead from the concussive shock of a near miss. He knew what happened inside a fighting compartment when something went wrong. 14 millimeters of turret wall between 4 crew members and the battlefield made him quietly furious in the contained way that serious engineers express fury through increasingly precise and pessimistic calculations documented in increasing detail. The rear door was his idea, or at least his insistence. The original design had no provision for efficient ammunition loading from outside the vehicle. Harold ran the numbers on how long it would take 2 loaders to handle shells through the roof hatches and concluded the rate of fire would be operationally unacceptable. He pushed for a full-height door in the rear turret wall combined with a winch system on the hull that could elevate shells to turret height. The compromise this enabled ammunition fed from below through the open rear door, received by the loaders, and rammed manually brought the theoretical rate of fire to approximately 1 round every 2 minutes under practiced conditions. 1 round every 2 minutes. For the largest anti-tank gun in history. It was not impressive by conventional standards. But the project's doctrine was never about rate of fire. The vehicle needed 1 shot to disable any armored target on the battlefield. The Hesh shell's mechanism, squashing against the armor surface and transmitting a shockwave that tore fragments off the inner face, worked independently of penetration. It worked through armor. A hit was in practical terms a kill, and from 1,800 meters in cover, with no return fire, the rate of fire was irrelevant. The first live firing trial was scheduled for 1955. Harold had spent 4 years on this project by then. He had solved the suspension loading problem by working with the chassis team to redistribute weight and adjust damper rates. He had redesigned the breech extraction mechanism 3 times after the original configuration, created a risk of hot propellant gas entering the fighting compartment during the loading cycle. He had personally supervised the installation of the fume extractor, the distinctive cylindrical bulge visible midway along the barrel, and tested its clearing cycle under simulated combat conditions until he was satisfied that the crew would not be gassed by their own gun. He was at the proving ground for the first firing. He stood with the other engineers and the military observers at the designated safe distance. The target was the turret of a Centurion tank and the gun mantlet of a Conqueror, the 2 best protected components of Britain's current armored inventory, selected specifically to demonstrate whether the gun met its specifications. And the loading team went through the sequence. Shell elevated by winch. First loader receives guides to breech. Second loader assists alignment. Shell rammed. Propellant charge loaded. Breech closed. Gunner acquires target. Commander gives the order. The sound by every account from that day was unlike anything the observers had experienced at a proving ground before. Not a crack. Not a bang. A blow, low-frequency physical felt in the chest before the ears registered it as sound. The propellant gases from 33 kilograms of burning charge created a momentary cloud around the vehicle. The Centurion hull compressed visibly on its suspension and recovered. Once downrange, the Centurion turret that had been set as a target ceased to exist in its previous configuration. The Conqueror's gun mantlet was split. Harold Webb stood and watched the dust settle and wrote 2 words in his notebook: "It works." The trials continued through 1955 and into 1956. Every technical requirement was met. Every penetration specification was satisfied. The gun performed exactly as the mathematics said it would, and the mathematics had been right. The FV4005, whatever its compromises and whatever its limitations, was exactly what it had been designed to be. But somewhere in Whitehall, in the same months that Harold and his team were confirming the gun's effectiveness at the proving ground, other offices were receiving reports about a different kind of weapon. Smaller, guided, capable of being carried by a single soldier, capable of destroying an IS-3 from distance, without a 50-ton chassis, without a 4-ton gun, without 2 men spending 2 minutes loading a shell that weighed as much as either of them. Harold did not know about these reports yet. None of the FV4005 team did. They were focused on their proving ground, their targets, their rate of fire drills, and their breach timing sequences. They believed they were building the future of British anti-armor capability. They were right about almost everything. The gun worked. The vehicle survived the recoil. The Hess shells did exactly what a 183mm squash head round does to armored steel, which is something that has to be witnessed to be understood and cannot be adequately described in any report. But in Part 2, the reports from those other offices will arrive. And when they do, everything Harold Webb spent 4 years building will face a question that no gun, however large, can answer with firepower alone. The question was not whether the FV4005 could kill a tank. It could. The question was whether the world still needed a 50-ton vehicle to do it. And the answer to that question, arriving quietly in 1957, will change everything. Harold Webb had proven the gun worked. The FV4005 had split a Conqueror mantlet in half at the proving ground. Every number, every specification, every impossible requirement on that original document had been met. The engineers went home satisfied. The observers filed their reports. And Harold Webb stood in his workshop the following Monday morning and waited for the next order to come down. It came. But it was not the order he expected. Dancy, Brigadier General Edmund Forsyth, had spent 31 years in the British Army and had developed over those 3 decades a very specific allergy to engineers who believed their laboratory results translated directly into battlefield reality. He had seen too many promising systems collapse the moment they encountered mud-cold fatigue and the fundamental chaos of men under fire. He had the kind of institutional authority that does not need to raise its voice, because the room already understands that disagreement carries a professional cost. He read the FV4005 trial report in 17 minutes. Harold knew this because the secretary timed it and told him afterward, in the way that secretaries sometimes share information they understand to be important. 17 minutes for 4 years of work. Forsyth's response arrived 3 days later in writing. It was precise, dismissive, and devastating in the way that only truly well-constructed bureaucratic resistance can be. The platform Forsyth wrote was inadequate. The Centurion chassis had not been designed to absorb repeated recoil forces of 95 tons. Long-term structural integrity could not be guaranteed without an extended durability program of no fewer than 18 months. The turret armor at 14 millimeters created unacceptable crew risk in any operational environment where the vehicle might encounter direct or indirect fire. The rate of fire 1 round every 2 minutes was operationally insufficient for a vehicle expected to operate independently at range. And the ammunition logistics chain required to supply 72.5 kilogram shells to forward positions had not been adequately studied or costed. Each objection was legitimate. Harold knew this. That was the particular cruelty of Forsyth's report. It was not wrong. Every concern he raised was real. The question was whether those concerns were decisive or whether they were the kind of problems that could be managed in operational doctrine. Harold believed the latter. Forsyth had already decided the former. The meeting was requested by Harold's project director, Colonel James Whitmore, and granted with visible reluctance. It took place in a conference room in Whitehall on a Tuesday morning in November 1955. Harold attended as technical advisor. He was not supposed to speak unless directly addressed. Bosch Forsyth sat at the head of the table with two staff officers flanking him and opened with a statement that was not a question. Your vehicle cannot sustain a combat tempo. 1 round every 2 minutes means a crew expends their entire ammunition load in 24 minutes of active engagement, after which they are a 50-ton target with no capability. Whitmore started to respond. Harold spoke instead, which was not the plan. With respect, sir, the vehicle was never designed for sustained engagement. The doctrine is 1 shot from concealment, then reposition. The rate of fire is irrelevant if the first shot eliminates the target. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Harold counted them. Mr. Webb, Forsyth said, doctrine written by engineers for vehicles that have never been in combat is the most expensive kind of fiction the ministry produces. The meeting ended 40 minutes later with nothing resolved. On the way out, Whitmore told Harold quietly that another outburst like that one would end his involvement with the project. Harold nodded and said nothing. But he was already thinking about Colonel Richard Ashford, who had attended one of the early proving ground demonstrations 8 months earlier and had asked better questions than anyone else in the room. Ashford ran the Armored Vehicle Trials Coordination Office, which meant he sat at the intersection of engineering results and operational requirements, the exact position where the FV4005's case needed to be made. Harold had kept his contact details. He used them the following week. They met for lunch, not a formal meeting, in a pub near Whitmore's office. Harold brought his notebook. Ashford brought nothing, which Harold interpreted as either confidence or indifference. It turned out to be the former. I read Forsyth's report, Ashford said. I also read the trial data. There's a gap between them that concerns me. The trial data shows the gun works, Harold said. The trial data shows the gun works once in good conditions against a stationary target with a rested crew. Ashford paused. What I need to know is whether it works under the conditions where it would actually be used. That's not what Forsyth is asking, but it's what I'm asking. This was the conversation Harold had been waiting 4 years to have with someone who had the authority to act on the answer. He leaned forward and started talking. The formal evaluation was approved 6 weeks later. Not a demonstration. Ashford was careful to use the word evaluation, which carried different institutional weight. It would take place at Lulworth Ranges in Dorset over 3 consecutive days in February 1956. The conditions were specified in advance, varying range distances from 800 to 1,800 meters. 2 different target types, live ammunition throughout crew rotation to simulate fatigue, and the final day's shooting to be conducted after the crew had operated continuously for 16 hours to replicate forward deployment conditions. Forsyth's office sent an observer. His name was Captain Garrett, and he arrived at Lulworth on the first morning with the specific posture of a man who has been sent to confirm a predetermined conclusion. Harold noticed this and said nothing about it to anyone. The first day's shooting began at 700 in conditions that February in Dorset reliably provides 4 degrees Celsius intermittent rain and a ground wind that made range estimation calculations slightly more complex than proving ground conditions. The first target, a hulked-out Centurion turret set at 900 meters, was engaged from a firing position behind a berm that required the FV4005 crew to crest briefly before acquiring the target. The shell hit. The Centurion turret, which had already survived 1 war and several previous trials, did not survive this. The spalling effect on the interior, captured on high-speed film for the evaluation record, was described in the subsequent report as total crew incapacitation would be certain. Captain Garrett wrote something in his notebook. His expression did not change. The second target at 1,400 meters was a Centurion hull with additional armor plate welded to the front to simulate potential Soviet improvements beyond the IS-3's standard specification. Harold had argued for including this target specifically. He wanted to demonstrate not just that the gun met current requirements, but that it exceeded them by a margin that addressed the War Office's concern about future Soviet developments. The shell hit the upper glacis of the reinforced hull. The additional armor plate 40 millimeters of welded steel that had been added on top of the existing protection was not sufficient. The spalling on the inner face of the original armor was severe enough that the evaluation team's armor specialist examining the target afterward stated flatly that the round had achieved effective penetration equivalent to defeating 280 millimeters of homogeneous armor. The IS-3's maximum protection was 230 millimeters. The margin was 50 millimeters. That was not a narrow success. That was dominance. Chapeau. Captain Garrett walked to the target and stood in front of it for almost 2 minutes without writing anything down. Harold stood nearby and waited. "How far was that shot?" Garrett asked. 1,400 meters, Harold said. "And the IS-3 specification calls for penetration at 1,800. "Yes." Garrett nodded slowly and walked back to the observation position. The third day was the one Harold had both prepared for and dreaded. The crew had been operating since 0500 the previous morning. 34 hours of continuous vehicle operation, minimal sleep field rations, the accumulated physical toll of handling shells that weighed 72.5 kilograms each through an entire day's evaluation schedule. The final shot of the evaluation would be fired at 1,800 meters, the maximum range in the specification against a target, representing the most heavily armored component of a Soviet heavy tank. Yay. The loader named Corporal Davies had loaded 31 shells over the previous 2 days. Harold had watched him slow down, had watched the second loader compensate, had watched the small adjustments that an experienced crew makes when fatigue begins to accumulate. The cycle time on day 3 was running at 2 minutes 40 seconds rather than 2 minutes flat. That was expected. Harold had documented it. The 30-second shell went into the breach at 1,400 hours on day 3. The crew had been awake for 33 hours. The target was 1,800 meters distant, partially obscured by the light haze that had settled over the range in the afternoon hours. The gunner, a sergeant named McAllister, who had not complained once in 3 days, made his range adjustment and reported ready. The shot broke across the Dorset Hills like a physical force. The Centurion hull sagged on its suspension. The cloud cleared. Downrange the target a Conqueror gun mantlet, the same type that had been split during the original proving ground trials, had been struck in its lower left quadrant. The mantlet was not split this time. It had been pushed physically backward off its mounting by the energy transfer, and the spalling on the interior face had produced fragments sufficient to incapacitate every position in a standard heavy tank turret. Harold looked at Captain Garrett. Garrett was looking at the target through his binoculars for a long time. Then he lowered them and turned. His expression had changed. Not dramatically, not the theatrical conversion of a man who has seen the light. Just a small, precise shift in the way his face was arranged that indicated something had updated in his assessment. "This will require a full written evaluation," Garrett said. "Of course," Harold said. "My recommendation will be that the project should proceed to the next phase." Harold wrote the time in his notebook, 14:17 hours, February 14, 1956. He underlined it. When the evaluation report reached Forsyth's office 3 weeks later, the recommendation for proceeding was upheld. Production planning for the FV4005 began moving through the approval process with Ashford's office, providing consistent institutional support at each stage. Harold was assigned to lead the technical transition team responsible for crew training standards and operational doctrine development. The training program began in spring 1956. Harold traveled to armored units across southern England carrying the evaluation data and a level of patience for institutional resistance that he had developed through necessity over the previous 5 years. The crews he encountered were skeptical in the practical way that soldiers develop when they have spent careers learning one system and are being asked to adopt something that contradicts most of their intuitions about how a tank should work. 1 shot every 2 minutes. A tank commander at Bovington told him flatly during the first training session. "That's not a tank. That's a liability." "It's not a tank," Harold said. "That's the point. Don't use it like one." Convincing men trained in one doctrine to internalize a fundamentally different one takes longer than any project timeline ever accounts for. Harold knew this. He built the training program around it. The crews who went through his program first came out understanding not just how to operate the FV4005, but why it existed, what specific problem it solved, and why conventional armor thinking was the wrong framework for it. The first operational deployment exercises in late 1956 showed results that the training program had predicted, but that still surprised the observers from the War Office. In simulated engagements against heavy armor, FV4005 crews, using the concealment and single-shot doctrine, achieved target kills at ranges where the defending vehicles had not yet identified the firing position. The margin was not close. In 12 simulated engagements, across 3 exercises, 11 resulted in target kills before the defending crew could respond effectively. 11 out of 12. Forsyth received that number in a briefing document and did not comment on it publicly. Harold was told about his reaction secondhand, a long silence followed by a request to see the raw exercise data. But in those same weeks, the signals from Whitehall were changing in a way that Harold had not yet noticed. The reports from other offices, the ones about guided missiles about the new generation of heat warheads that a single soldier could carry and launch, were accumulating in folders that sat in the same building where Ashford's favorable evaluation had been filed. 2 different futures for anti-armor warfare being assessed simultaneously by people who had the authority to choose between them. Harold was in Birmingham in late 1956, supervising a modification to the ammunition feed winch, when he received a message that there would be a review meeting in London the following month. A comprehensive review, not of the FV4005's performance, of the entire heavy direct-fire anti-tank program. He took the train back to London that evening and sat in his compartment watching the Midlands give way to the home counties, and tried to calculate what a comprehensive review meant and whether 11 kills out of 12 was a number that could survive whatever was coming. Yet, in Part 3, the answer arrives, and it has nothing to do with the gun or the trials or the 11 kills out of 12. It has to do with a missile the size of a fence post that could do everything the FV4005 could do and cost less than a single one of Harold Webb's 183mm shells. The world had not waited for the FV4005 to be ready, and now the reckoning was coming. Harold Webb had built the impossible. A 183mm gun on a Centurion chassis. 11 kills out of 12 in operational exercises. The War Office had approved the next phase. The training program was running. The FV4005 had gone from a blueprint that made no sense to a weapon system that worked exactly as designed. But in late 1956, 2 things were happening simultaneously that Harold did not yet fully understand. The Soviets were watching, and somewhere in a ministry building in London, a man was holding a report about a guided missile that weighed 12 kilograms and could kill the same targets as Harold's 183mm gun. The comprehensive review was 6 weeks away, and this time the threat to the FV4005 was not coming from Brigadier General Forsyth. It was coming from physics economics and the unstoppable logic of a technology that made everything Harold had built feel suddenly, irreversibly large. This is where the story stops being about one engineer's fight to prove a gun works, and starts being about whether the world the gun was built for still exists. Soviet military intelligence had been tracking British armored vehicle development through standard channels since 1945. What they received in late 1955 and through 1956 were fragments shipping manifests from Lulworth procurement orders for specialized ammunition components, unusual requests for 183mm barrel stock from British steel suppliers. The fragments were ambiguous individually. Assembled by analysts in Moscow, they pointed toward something that the Soviet armor establishment found both impressive and immediately concerning. The IS-3 had been designed with specific assumptions about Western anti-tank capability. Its armor profile, the pike nose, the hemispherical turret, the calculated slope angles had been optimized against the threat environment that existed in 1943 and 1944. A 183mm Hesh round, operating at 1,800 meters, fell outside the parameters that Soviet engineers had used when they made those calculations. It fell outside them by a significant margin. General Alexei Vetrov, commanding Soviet armor development at the time, convened an emergency technical review in January 1956, after the assembled intelligence picture reached his desk. The meeting lasted 9 hours. The conclusion, documented in Soviet military archives and later examined by Western historians after declassification, was stark if the British weapon system performed as the intelligence suggested. The IS-3 and IS-4 were no longer adequate in their current configuration against a British armored force equipped with this gun. The response was immediate and multidirectional. Soviet engineers began accelerating work on the T-10, the successor to the IS series, with specific attention to the roof and rear armor profiles that a long-range plunging Hesh round would most effectively engage. Active armor research, which had been progressing slowly through the early 1950s, received a significant budget increase, and Soviet military doctrine for armored operations in Central Europe was quietly revised to reduce the operational time that heavy tanks would spend in positions where they were potentially exposed to long-range direct fire from static defensive positions. The Soviets were adapting. They were adapting to a weapon that had not yet entered service. That was the measure of how seriously they took the threat the FV4005 represented. British intelligence picked up fragments of this adaptation in mid-1956. The reports reached Ashford's office. Harold received a summary through Whitmore. The Soviets were changing their armor development priorities in ways that correlated precisely with the FV4005's capabilities. It was in the clearest possible way, confirmation that the weapon worked, that the enemy had assessed it and decided they needed to respond. Harold should have found this deeply satisfying. He did not entirely, because the same intelligence summary that confirmed the FV4005's strategic impact also noted increased Soviet investment in anti-tank missile technology that was by 1956 producing systems with capabilities that overlapped significantly with the gun Harold had spent 5 years building. But the Soviets were not the only ones adapting. The internal pressure that had been building inside the British defense establishment since early 1956 reached Harold directly in October of that year in the form of a technical failure that he had not anticipated, and that in the wrong hands became the most damaging argument against the entire program. The third FV4005 prototype had been undergoing extended durability trials at a separate facility from the main evaluation program. The trials were designed to simulate 6 months of operational use in compressed form, repeated firing cycles, sustained movement across rough terrain, the accumulated mechanical stress that a vehicle experiences when it is actually used rather than demonstrated. On October 9, 1956, during the 47th firing cycle of that extended trial, the turret ring bearing assembly showed measurable deformation. Not catastrophic failure, not a safety incident. Measurable deformation detected during a routine inspection between firing cycles that indicated the Centurion hull's turret ring was experiencing stress accumulation faster than the design tolerance predicted. Harold received the report on October 11th. He read it 4 times. The deformation was real. The cause was clear. The 95-ton recoil applied repeatedly over 47 cycles was stressing the turret ring in ways that the original Centurion hull design had not been built to accommodate. It was the concern he had documented in his notebook in 1951, dated and underlined when he first saw the recoil specification. The mathematics had been correct. The timeline had simply taken 5 years to confirm it. The question was what it meant operationally. Harold's assessment was that the issue was manageable. The turret ring could be reinforced with a relatively modest engineering modification and operational doctrine. Limiting firing cycles per deployment period would provide additional protection for the hull structure. The problem was solvable. It was not a fundamental design flaw. It was an engineering refinement, the kind that every vehicle program produces when extended trials push the system beyond its initial design envelope. And Captain Garrett, who was still involved with the evaluation process, saw the report before Harold had submitted his own assessment. Garrett's memo to Forsyth's office went out the same day, and it was not titled Engineering Refinement. It was titled Structural Integrity Concern FV4005 Extended Trials. The difference in framing was not accidental. Forsyth called a meeting. Harold attended. Forsyth opened by asking how many firing cycles an operational crew might be expected to complete in a 30-day deployment period. Harold said approximately 45 to 60 cycles under high-tempo conditions. Forsyth looked at him for a moment without expression, and then said that the vehicle had demonstrated structural deformation at 47 cycles under trial conditions, which were presumably better maintained than operational conditions, and asked Harold to explain what that implied for crew safety in sustained combat operations. It was a fair question. Harold did not have a fully satisfying answer. He had a partial answer, the reinforcement solution, the doctrine modification, but partial answers in a room with Forsyth were not partial answers. They were concessions. The meeting ended with the durability trial suspended pending further review. Harold went back to Birmingham that evening and stood in his workshop for a long time without working. He was not doubting the gun. He was not doubting the engineering. He was doubting for the first time in 5 years whether the institutional environment would allow the engineering solutions to exist long enough to be implemented. Then, in November 1956, an event occurred that had nothing to do with the FV4005 and changed everything about the context in which it was being evaluated. The Suez Crisis had been building through the summer and autumn of 1956. On October 29th, Israeli forces crossed into Sinai. On October 31st, British and French forces began air operations against Egyptian targets. On November 5th, British paratroopers landed at Port Said. It was the first large-scale British military operation since Korea, and it was being watched by everyone in the defense establishment with the specific attention that comes from knowing that real equipment is meeting real conditions. British armored units in the Suez operation were equipped with Centurion tanks, not FV4005 vehicles. The FV4005 was still in trials, but Centurions. And the Centurions were encountering Egyptian armor that included Soviet-supplied vehicles, including some IS-3-derived designs. The engagements provided in brutal compressed form exactly the data that the long theoretical debate about anti-armor requirements had been generating abstractions about for 11 years. At Port Said, on November 6, 1956, a Centurion troop engaged Egyptian armor at ranges between 600 and 900 meters. The results were documented in the after-action reports that reached the War Office within 2 weeks. At those ranges against Soviet pattern armor, the Centurion's 20-pounder gun performed adequately against lighter vehicles and side engagements. Against the frontal protection of heavier Egyptian armor, the results were less definitive. Several engagements required multiple rounds to achieve kills. 2 Centurions were hit and disabled, and the engagement data was not catastrophic. The British operation at Suez was not a failure of armor, but the data contained one number that landed in Whitehall like a slow-burning fuse at 900 meters against the heaviest Egyptian armor encountered. The 20-pounder's penetration probability on a frontal engagement was assessed at approximately 60%. 60%. Against vehicles that were not IS-3s, against vehicles that represented a generation behind the IS-3 in armor protection. Harold received a copy of the Suez Armor Engagement Summary in December 1956. He read it once and did not need to read it again. He understood immediately what it meant for the FV4005 program, and specifically for the durability review that Forsyth had used to suspend the extended trials. The question was no longer whether the FV4005 was necessary. Suez had answered that. The question was whether the durability issue could be resolved before the institutional momentum shifted completely toward the missile advocates who were now using the Suez data to argue that the entire paradigm of large-caliber direct-fire anti-armor guns was obsolete, regardless of their individual effectiveness. Harold drafted the engineering modification specification for the turret ring reinforcement in December 1956. He submitted it with a covering letter that referenced the Suez engagement data directly, and argued that the FV4005's 183mm gun would have achieved first-round kills on every vehicle encountered at Port Said, from ranges at which those vehicles would not have been able to identify the FV4005's firing position. The letter was precise, technically grounded, and completely correct. It was received in Forsyth's office on January 8, 1957. The comprehensive review was scheduled for February. Harold had 7 weeks to make the argument that should have been unnecessary to make that a weapon system proven effective, operationally validated, strategically confirmed by Soviet adaptation, and directly relevant to the capability gap exposed at Suez, deserved to survive a review that was increasingly being shaped by advocates for a technology that had not yet demonstrated equivalent effectiveness in any real operational environment. He had the data, he had the engineering solutions, he had the Suez after-action reports. He had 11 kills out of 12 in operational exercises, a number that represented a standard of effectiveness that no other British anti-armor system had matched at equivalent ranges. What he was about to discover in the February review was that data is not the currency that institutional decisions are made in. The currency is momentum. And by January 1957, the momentum in the British defense establishment had shifted toward something small, light, and guided. The review was in 31 days. Harold went back to his calculations. He checked the turret ring reinforcement specifications for the 4th time. He reviewed the Hesh shell effectiveness data against the new generation of Soviet armor that intelligence suggested was under development. He built the most comprehensive technical case that 5 years of engineering work could produce. And somewhere in a room he had not been invited into, men who had never loaded a 72.5-kilogram shell in the dark were deciding whether his gun had a future. In Part 4, the decision comes down. The FV4005's fate is sealed in a single meeting. And what Harold Webb does afterward, what he says where he goes, and what survives of everything he built, is the part of this story that the official records almost entirely omit. The chapter that most histories of the Cold War arms race skip past without stopping. The ending that the machine itself, standing silent in a museum in Dorset, has been waiting 70 years for someone to tell properly. 5 years, 1 engineer, 1 gun that no nation has surpassed in 70 years. Harold Webb had taken a blueprint that made no sense, fought a brigadier general who did not want it to exist, survived a durability crisis that nearly ended the program, and built the most powerful anti-tank weapon in history on a chassis that was never designed to carry it. The Suez data had confirmed the capability gap the FV4005 was built to close. The Soviets had already changed their armor development program in response to a weapon that had not yet entered service. Everything pointed toward continuation. But the comprehensive review was 31 days away, and Harold was about to discover that the most dangerous enemy a good idea can face is not a bad idea. It is a cheaper idea, arriving at exactly the right moment, backed by men who understand that in institutional warfare, timing is everything. The twist at the end of this story is not what the gun did. It is what happened to the man who built it, and what that tells us about how progress actually works. The February 1957 review lasted 2 days. Harold attended both sessions. He presented his engineering case for the turret ring reinforcement on the first morning, the modification specifications, the cost estimate, the implementation timeline. He presented the operational effectiveness data in the afternoon. 11 kills from 12 attempts at ranges exceeding 1,400 meters. Soviet armor doctrine revision confirmed by intelligence. Suez engagement data demonstrating the capability gap that the FV4005 had been specifically designed to address. The missile advocates presented on the second day. Their presentation was shorter. The guided anti-tank missile program had advanced significantly through 1956. The Malkara missile, developed jointly with Australia, had demonstrated kill probability exceeding 80% against stationary heavy armor at ranges up to 1,800 meters. It weighed 98 kilograms, including the launcher compared to the FV4005's 52-ton platform. It required a crew of 2 rather than 4. It cost a fraction of the per-round cost of the 183mm ammunition, and it did not require turret ring reinforcement. The decision, when it came, was not announced dramatically. It arrived in writing to Whitmore's office on March 14, 1957. The FV4005 project was cancelled. The FV215, the heavier vehicle on the Conqueror chassis with the same gun that had been developing in parallel, was cancelled the same day. Both programs closed simultaneously, as if someone had decided that drawing a single line through an entire development direction was more efficient than closing them individually. Harold received the news by telephone. He said very little. He thanked the person who called, replaced the receiver, and sat in his workshop in Birmingham for the better part of an hour, doing nothing at all. Then he picked up his notebook, the same notebook he had carried since 1951, the one with the recoil calculation dated and underlined on the 3rd page, and wrote the date. March 14, 1957. He did not write anything else on that page. He was 49 years old. He had spent 6 years of his working life on a project that would never enter production. He had solved every problem they asked him to solve. He had met every specification. He had answered every objection with an engineering solution that worked. The gun itself, the record it set, the 183mm that remains unmatched to this day, that was his. That would always be his. But the machine was going into storage, and Harold Webb was going back to Birmingham, and the Ministry of Defense was not planning a ceremony. What happened to Harold in the years that followed is, in its own quiet way, the most instructive part of this entire story. He did not receive a decoration for the FV4005 work. He was not invited to speak at conferences about the engineering achievement the program represented. The project had been cancelled, which in institutional terms meant it had not succeeded, and things that do not succeed do not generate the administrative paperwork that leads to formal recognition. He returned to general engineering work. He took a position at a vehicle engineering firm in Coventry in 1958 and spent the next 11 years working on commercial vehicle suspension systems work that was competent, well regarded within the industry, and completely invisible to anyone who tracked the history of British armored vehicle development. The men who had worked alongside him at Lulworth, who had watched the Conqueror mantlet split and written "It works" in their own notebooks, went their separate ways into the dispersed anonymity that defense engineers inhabit when the projects that define them are classified or cancelled. Colonel Ashford, who had made the formal evaluation possible, was promoted to brigadier in 1959 and retired in 1963. He gave an interview to a defense journal in 1971 in which he briefly mentioned the FV4005 as an example of a technically successful program that had been overtaken by technological change. He described the 183mm gun as the most convincing demonstration of firepower I witnessed in 30 years of military service. He did not mention Harold Webb by name. Harold, reading the interview in Coventry, did not appear to have expected him to. Forsyth retired in 1960. His record showed a distinguished career in armor procurement. The FV4005 did not appear in his official biography. The man who had most consistently opposed the program was also in the strange justice of institutional memory, the man whose name appeared most often in the program's administrative records, because opposition generates paperwork in ways that quiet engineering work does not. Harold Webb died in 1981 in Coventry. He was 73 years old. His obituary in the local paper described him as a retired vehicle engineer. It did not mention the FV4005. It did not mention the 183mm gun. It did not mention that he had built something that no nation on earth had managed to surpass in the 24 years since his project was cancelled, or in the 44 years since? Wait. His notebook. The one with the recoil calculation on the third page, dated 1951. Passed to his son, who was an accountant in Warwick and had no particular interest in military history. The notebook sat in a box in a storage room for 19 years. In the year 2000, Harold's son donated a collection of his father's professional papers to the Bovington Tank Museum, which had by then been housing the sole surviving FV4005 prototype for over 4 decades. The museum archivists cataloged the papers carefully. Among them was the notebook. Among the notebook's entries was the recoil calculation from 1951 correctly predicting the stress accumulation that the extended durability trials would later confirm at the 47th firing cycle. Harold had identified the problem 6 years before it appeared. He had documented it, dated it, and kept working anyway because the problem was solvable, and someone had to solve it. The notebook is in the museum archive now. It is not on public display, but it exists, which is more than can be said for most of the thinking that goes into weapons that never enter service. The Hesh shell principle that the FV4005 was built around did not disappear when the project was cancelled. It survived refined and adapted in British armoured ammunition for decades afterward. The 120mm Hesh rounds used by the Chieftain tank, which entered service in 1966, carried forward the core ballistic principle that Harold's 183mm program had explored at its maximum possible scale. The Challenger 1 and Challenger 2 maintained Hesh capability through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The principle of a shell that transmits energy through armor rather than penetrating it remained operationally relevant for 50 years after the FV4005 was cancelled, appearing in conflicts from the Falklands to the Gulf War, in configurations that owed their development lineage, however, indirectly to the proving groundwork at Lulworth in 1955 and 1956. The Malkara missile that replaced the FV4005 conceptually did enter service with the British Army in 1958. It was used operationally through the 1960s, before being superseded by more advanced guided systems. Its accuracy in operational conditions proved somewhat lower than the proving ground demonstrations had suggested, a pattern that the FV4005's critics might have found ironic, given that Harold's gun had achieved 11 kills from 12 attempts under simulated operational fatigue conditions specifically to address that concern. The guided missile paradigm was correct in strategic terms. The specific system that replaced the FV4005 was not the revolutionary solution its advocates had promised. This is also how progress works. The single surviving FV4005 prototype reached Bovington through the straightforward process of institutional inertia. The 2 vehicles that remained in storage after cancellation were eventually scrapped for parts, and the third was transferred to the museum, rather than destroyed because someone in the logistics chain decided that transferring was easier than scrapping. There was no deliberate decision to preserve it as a historical artifact. It survived because disposal required more effort than retention. As this is the detail that most histories of the FV4005 omit, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The only physical evidence that 6 years of Harold Webb's engineering life ever happened exists today, because a logistics clerk in 1957 or 1958 chose the path of least resistance. The most powerful anti-tank gun ever built survived into the 21st century, not through institutional recognition of its significance, but through administrative convenience. It stands in Bovington now. You can buy a ticket and walk up to it. The 183mm muzzle is at approximately chest height for an average adult, and looking into it, even knowing the physics of what it produced, creates a sensation that photographs do not prepare you for. The scale is simply different in person. The rectangular turret with its 14mm walls that Harold argued about and lost the rear door that was his insistence and his solution, the fume extractor mid-barrel that he tested and retested until he was satisfied all of it is there intact, carrying no particular institutional weight in the way the vehicle is presented, because the museum reasonably enough cannot know which specific engineer fought for which specific detail. What the vehicle carries instead is the record. The 183mm caliber for an anti-tank gun. Set in the mid-1950s by a team of British engineers working under pressure with inadequate time and imperfect constraints on a chassis that everyone agreed was not quite right for the job. The record has stood for more than 70 years. It will almost certainly continue to stand, because the strategic logic that produced it, the escalating arms race between armor protection and armor penetration, resolved itself through guided missiles and composite armor, rather than through larger and larger gun calibers. No nation needs to build a 200mm anti-tank gun. The FV4005's record is safe, not because it was an unreachable achievement, but because nobody needs to reach it. There is a specific kind of courage required to spend years building something that you know might never be used. Harold Webb knew from 1951 that the Centurion chassis was not an ideal platform. He said so in writing and kept working. He knew the turret armor was inadequate for front-line survival and documented his objections and designed the best turret he could within the constraints he was given. He knew the rate of fire would invite criticism from officers whose entire professional framework was built around different operational assumptions, and he designed the rear door and the winch system to make the rate of fire as good as the physics would allow. He worked on solvable problems and kept clear records of unsolvable ones. This is not the story of a man who changed the outcome of a war. The FV4005 never fired a shot in anger. It never crossed a border. It never caused a single enemy casualty. The IS-3 tanks it was designed to defeat were obsolete before the gun was canceled, and the Cold War it was built to influence resolved itself through economics and politics, rather than through any particular weapon system. Harold Webb's engineering contribution to global history is, by any conventional measure, approximately zero, but the record stands, and the notebook is in the archive, and the vehicle is in the museum. And 70 years after a parade of Soviet tanks walked through ruined Berlin and frightened Allied officers into commissioning the largest anti-tank gun in history, a child can stand in Bovington and peer into a 183mm muzzle and feel briefly and unmistakably the physical reality of what serious engineering looks like when it is applied to an impossible problem by a man who is not going to stop until it is solved. That is what Harold Webb left behind. Not a weapon. Not a doctrine, not a named innovation in any textbook. Just a machine that worked standing in a museum because someone found it easier to store than destroy, carrying a record that nobody needs to break, waiting patiently for the next person who wants to understand what happens when ordinary men are given extraordinary problems and refuse to set them down. The record is 183mm. The man who built the gun that set it was a tooling engineer from Birmingham who kept a notebook. The notebook is in the archive. The gun is in the museum, and the IS-3 tanks that started everything, the ones that rolled through Berlin in September 1945, while Allied officers stood in silence and felt the future shift beneath them, are gone. Scrapped. Melted down. Returned to the same steel from which Harold Webb's impossible gun was made. Only the record survives. And the question it leaves behind is the same one Harold was answering every day for 6 years in a cold workshop with grease on his hands and a notebook in his pocket. How much is enough, and who decides when to stop?